Hey, folks, I'm Rob Breakenridge. Thanks so much for joining us. Danielle Smith is calling it a good day for Alberta and for Canada. The Premier and the Prime Minister have signed an agreement to advance the MOU between Alberta and Ottawa, some consensus on carbon pricing and emissions reduction, which will pave the way for a pipeline proposal, one that will presumably then be declared to be in the national interest, and a possible approval of this project by September of next year. Still a lot of questions about all of this, and of course, this comes amid the backdrop of a political debate in Alberta about the province's future in Confederation, and a court ruling this week that for now puts a halt to a separatist petition campaign. Joining us for some thoughts on this, very pleased to welcome back to the program here Andrew Leach. He's an energy and environmental economist at the University of Alberta with joint appointments in the Faculties of Arts and Law. Andrew Leach, great to have you with us here.
Thanks for having me back.
Certainly a big announcement with Danielle Smith and Mark Carney, some questions about private proponents, some questions about a route for this pipeline, questions about an ambitious timeline and consultation. We can go down the list. What stood out to you on Friday here, first of all?
I think the link between pathways and the pipeline remains the big question mark, right? We're talking about pathways with a timeline to start by 2035 and a pipeline that, as you just said, we are talking about having approved on a much shorter timeline than that. And yet the pipeline being conditional on pathways. So I don't know how all of those pieces fit together.
Yeah, it's interesting. The carbon capture and storage is linked, or certainly the Prime Minister has insisted it's linked to this idea. But under this ambitious timeline, you could have that pipeline complete before pathways would even get off the ground.
Yeah, long before, and by the timelines that are set out in the implementation agreement today, it seems like if everything goes to plan, you have that pipeline built and operating before a proponent's going to have to make a final investment decision on any part of pathways. And so to me, that's a little bit out of sequence. Given the timeline, the time that we've spent talking about carbon capture and storage in the oil sands. I mean, I worked on Premier Stelmach's carbon capture and storage implementation panel back in, 2009. And we've been talking about it. We've had multiple consortia. Like, this should be something that we at least know the pretty specific parameters of such a project. And so to think, okay, we need another 9 years for phase one, to me is a little bit disappointing.
Does this, with the carbon pricing included here, does this give any more certainty then, at least to spurring those investments and moving forward here?
I think it gives some. I mean, the question that I had in reading the implementation agreements, they have the price floor, which effectively says the government of Alberta is going to somehow enforce a transaction price. I would have rather seen, and I've advocated for a long time, for just a government default purchase option. So instead of selling your credits to another player in the sector, you can just sell your credits back to the government of Alberta in the same way as you can buy credits from the government of Alberta rather than from your competitors. So if we just had a buyback provision, I think it solves the problem pretty easily. I don't know that the government's going to want to be involved in third-party transactions to the degree that seems to be contemplated right now. So we'll see what happens on that. And then there's the carbon contract for differences option, which I think is where you're going to see the big action on pathways, a more guaranteed longer term carbon price. I mean, I don't love the fact that you still have that in there. If we think we have certainty on carbon pricing, then you probably don't need the CCFDs. And I worry that if you put in the CCFDs, then you're essentially giving companies license to be on both sides of the ball here, to say, on the one hand, I've got my abatement locked in. Now, on the other hand, I'd like there to be lower carbon prices for my emissions.
Is this still Alberta's carbon levy? I mean, Alberta's, it's the tier program.
It is still tier.
2007, right?
Yeah, still tier. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, it's operated under 3 different names with different design tweaks, but it's, fundamentally pretty well the same basic architecture that we've seen since 2007.
So, yeah, it's interesting that, when we talk about a project like this, it invokes the duty to consult, and that's relevant to this whole other matter, this court ruling this week. But in terms then of moving forward on a project like this, and what we've seen and what we've learned over the past decade or longer even about the importance of that and about the importance of doing it right.
Yeah.
Have we learned those lessons? What's your assessment of this ambitious timeline and where we go from here?
I think the thing to keep in mind with the duty to consult is it's all about operating in good faith. It's the Crown operating or behaving honorably with respect to and taking account of its relationships with First Nations people, their rights, including but not limited to treaty rights. And so I think if you start from that footing and you say, what is it that I would expect if I were a rights holder in the context of this project? So, I mean, they're not the same. They don't have the same constitutional protection. But imagine right now you're a landowner on what was the historic proposed route for the Northern Gateway pipeline leaving from Bruderheim, or roughly that, right? You're hearing talk about a pipeline to the West Coast. You have no idea what that will mean for your property rights. And before a government approved a pipeline with a specific route, you would probably expect that there would be an opportunity for you to engage, for you to comment on the detailed route design, for you to know what that route design was, and for you to think about how it's going to affect you. Now imagine those property rights were elevated to constitutionally protected in the same way as Indigenous rights are. What would rights holders expect? And I think if you start with that frame of mind to say, yes, these rights are constitutionally protected. The government has a duty to act in good faith. And when they are going to infringe on those rights, part of that duty is to consult in advance. So, we don't have to see it as this hurdle or veto necessarily. It's a requirement to engage in good faith and to hopefully make the project better as a result.
There's the economics of it too. And I mean, we certainly see what Trans Mountain has been able to deliver and the benefits from that project. But still, adding another pipeline to the West Coast in the midst of some other projects like this Bridger pipeline to the United States, expanding Trans Mountain, expanding the Enbridge main lines. So making sense of all of that, having those shipper commitments, how does that all factor in?
I mean, it is kind of the way things go, right? When you have some demand for new shipping capacity or incremental shipping capacity, there are going to be lots of players who have the ability to provide that and whose investors want them to expand their asset base. So Enbridge, of course, wants to expand the mainline, bring more capital into that system, build the value of its asset. South Bow and Bridger, they want to that project. There's some capital there that's right now stranded. We want to make use of that. TMX potential expansion, and are there enough potential barrels? Are companies going to be willing to invest enough to build out capacity fast enough to fill all of those? Probably not, but that's actually a nice role for the market to play, in part to say, let's have an open season. Let's see what happens when contracts are available on all of these pipelines. Which ones does the market want to back? Happy with that. The question then turns to regulators. If they get to a point where we don't have contractual backing on all of these pipelines, would a Canadian regulator decide, you know what, it's still in our interest to have that incremental sovereign offtake capacity to the West Coast?
Yeah. Well, and that almost becomes like a political consideration at some level, which does perhaps open the door to Alberta being part of this bid or this consortium to move this forward, or government facilitating perhaps some Indigenous ownership. Does that seem like that's a likely or even a necessary component of a bid here?
Yeah, I mean, Alberta has to play some big role, and Alberta has in the past, right? We had contracted capacity on Keystone XL and Energy East. And I think we should. As resource owners, we don't want our barrels to be picking the transportation route of last resort. We want to make sure that our barrels, as resource owners, that we capture the highest value for our barrels. So the APMC should be engaged in that. Alberta needs to build, I think, we heard the Prime Minister use the word free, prior, and informed consent today, needs to build that consent or near consent from at least the lion's share of First Nations on the route. And I think ownership, real equity participation is going to be the way to do that. Alberta's in a good position to broker that. So I think both of those are going to happen on this pipeline. And, just on the sovereign offtake, right? Remember that up until TMX opened, Canada's largest oil export port was in Houston or thereabouts, right? We were exporting more barrels off the US Gulf Coast than anywhere else. And if we look at expanding Bridger and expanding Enbridge and expanding Keystone, or building Bridger, expanding Keystone, expanding Enbridge, that's where our barrels are going. So I think, as you say, it's a political question. Do we want to have our oil export port to be on the US Gulf Coast? And I think the answer to that is probably no.
Given the likelihood of Indigenous involvement in this project, and of course the need to engage in meaningful consultation, it's a fine line the premier has to walk here, and not undermining this project, but the way she's responding to the court ruling this week, that also deals, of course, with the duty to consult as it pertains to a potential secession referendum in Alberta. Are we potentially getting into some complicated territory here that could even risk undermining this project?
I think definitely we are, and to see the premier suggest that, in a way we're what I say, we're trying to figure out where that line is, where Alberta doesn't have to consult. And I think the question they should be asking is, why aren't we? Right? There is clearly contemplation on the part of the government of Alberta of a situation where Alberta is no longer in Canada. That is clearly a risk that is there. That is clearly something that, at the very least, the premier has made it easier for those seeking to separate to trigger a vote. So if you're thinking of the possibility of running an international border down the middle of the numbered treaties that exist in this province, that seems like something you should consult with the affected treaty nations on. Right. And the same way as, I see a lot of people drawing parallels to the Cowichan property decision in BC. As the government is acting on that, engaging on that, thinking about the future of that, they should be engaging with and informing landowners in the Lower Mainland about what they're thinking. And, I know, again, they're not the same constitutionally protected rights, but the mentality, I think it's very useful for Albertans to think, if my rights were being threatened, discussed, put on the table, whatever anchor there is for those rights, would I expect the government to engage with me in good faith and to explain to me what is going on and to hear my concerns and take my input? And the answer is absolutely not. Absolutely, I would. And if the government were going to court saying, well, at what point do I really have to do this? Right? That in itself is setting the relationship off on a bad foot. So I think, if you're talking about the legal question, that's one thing. If you're saying, well, should the government acting honorably in this situation be consulting with rights holders who might be affected in the event of a positive referendum result on separation, or a yes to separation? Negative for me, but positive in the sense of a yes vote. I think the government should be out there doing that, and to fight that in the courts, and to say, well, we're only going to do the minimum that a judge would have us do, and we're going to talk about that as being anti-democratic. I think that does have the potential to say, okay, those same people who are engaging on that question are going to be the ones doing the engagement on the pipeline. And and for some of the same affected nations. And so I think we want to be very careful about how we advance those two files simultaneously.
Yeah, I think that's something important that the government needs to consider. And on the other hand, maybe there is a need for some further clarity around all of this. At one point, that obligation does kick in, and what that has to look like. I think some have pointed out, well, Quebec's had two referendums in the past, and these issues didn't arise. I think arguably the way the Supreme Court sees, Section 35, the duty to consult, all of that, they might look at things a little bit differently now. But do you see that there is some value at all in an appeal to get some further clarity around all of this?
There might be value and clarity on the specific circumstance of a petition under the Citizens Initiative Act. For this one, though, I think it is potentially moot, given that the law actually says once it's been rejected, it can't come back. So the first part of the decision on judicial review was that should never have been considered. Petition should never have been considered a second time after it had been rejected in the wake of the Sylvester decision. Mm-hmm. So, I think you might get clarity, you might not. But, I think if we learn anything from the pipelines cases and others, the real question isn't, can I come up with a litmus test where I can, pour a bunch of facts into a blender, dip an indicator in it, and it comes back red, I have to consult. It really is about, is the government acting consistently with the honor of the crown? Is the government taking its decisions seriously when it knows that or feels that it might affect Indigenous rights? Is it opening the door to consultation? And I don't know that you're going to get the type of judicial clarity on this question that some people are asking for, in the same way as you wouldn't get it, as I said, with other rights that might be engaged. And with respect to the Quebec question, you're right that it didn't come up, certainly in the initial Quebec referendum. It came up late in the 95 process, but all of the jurisprudence on what we now know of the duty to consult comes after that. It comes in the late 90s and onwards from the Supreme Court and all of the pipelines decisions and various other decisions. So that's relatively new concept when we think about how the government should, or how the Crown will approach a situation where rights are going to be infringed. And so the rights get kind of recognized and affirmed, I guess, in the Constitution Act in 82, but then figuring out how that works with things like major projects or with things like legislative initiatives, these are still evolving. We're still learning about it. And so I don't think the fact that it didn't come up in Quebec, I think it would absolutely come up if you had a parallel process today. Quebec will be different because of modern treaty and such in the Quebec context, but it'd be a very different environment for a referendum today than it was in 95.
Well, I do wonder, I mean, maybe this Forever Canadian petition and just a simpler sort of question doesn't involve some of these same constitutional issues. Maybe that's the way forward here. But I do wonder, I mean, this isn't just about striking down Elections Alberta's approval of this petition. It's about what the government did or didn't do. So if the Alberta government were to proceed anyway under the Referendum Act and put that same question on the ballot, do you think that is still on shaky legal ground, at least under this ruling?
Again, I think the test here is when the Crown contemplates conduct that might affect Indigenous rights. So if the Premier and Cabinet is going to say, we're putting forward a question under the Referendum Act, they are they are contemplating conduct, right? They're contemplating a situation where they would negotiate secession. They're triggering a process that, if the government's being honest with itself and with voters, one of the logical outcomes of that process would be a government looking to negotiate amendments to the Constitution for the purposes of secession. And so, that clearly engages treaty rights. And so I think there again, would a court invalidate a referendum on that basis? I don't know the answer to that question. It would depend on a lot of the circumstances. Should the government be out there saying, look, this is what's going to happen. This is what it looks like. This is what our views can be. I think the answer to that is unequivocally yes. And I think we spend maybe a little too much time, in this question of when is a court going to find that the duty to consult exists? When is it going to be breached or not met? I think go back to that question of the honor of the Crown and say, if it were me and these were my rights and they were constitutionally protected and the government was clearly engaging in a process that might affect them, what would I expect from the government?
We'll see how it all unfolds in the weeks and months ahead. Andrew Leach, appreciate your insight. Thanks again for making some time for us here.
Thanks so much, Rob.
All right, once again, that was Andrew Leach, energy and environmental economist at the University of Alberta, also in the Faculty of Law at the U of A. So some overview of this agreement between Alberta and Ottawa, where that goes from here, what that looks like, and talking about some of the other legal aspects that come into play regarding the duty to consult on a pipeline project and the duty to consult in other realms, like, for example, a referendum on separation. So all of these things all happening at once, and it makes a really interesting political dynamic in Alberta and some big decisions for Alberta's premier in trying to advance this pipeline project, which, and I think in fairness to her, has also been about trying to quell separatist sentiment, to get a political win, but also something that demonstrates that maybe things have changed or that maybe, Canada can still work for Alberta. And yes, I think that if this project, this agreement moves forward, that does take a lot of wind out of the sails of the separatists. But still at the same time, there's that political pressure on her to allow for a referendum. So with the petition process, it's been more hands-off. It's just about, we're letting this go through. We're letting the petition and that whole process take its course, and the Alberta government's just kind of staying out of the way. Now, they've had to clear some obstacles for the separatists along the way, but that's what they're doing, right? They're just sort of allowing that to proceed. With that court decision and quashing that petition, It forces the government to get more involved if they feel that they need to deliver on a referendum. But the Alberta government calling that referendum, that's a different story than just allowing a petition to go through. And especially when we got a court ruling that invokes the duty to consult and treaty rights and Indigenous rights, that makes things a little more complicated on getting that pipeline project moving forward and some of those same issues that come into play there. Let me play for you here. This was following the joint announcement by the Premier and the Prime Minister. They each held separate press conferences to answer some questions. Here was Alberta's Premier answering some questions about navigating all of this and the concern that having a separatist vote could put an investment chill on this project, or how these could sort of bump into one another. Here's what she said to that.
I support sovereignty within a united Canada. That means something. That means Alberta should stay a part of Canada and continue to pursue and support and enshrine our constitutionally in invested rights, and also make sure that the federal government respects them. That's what today's about. It's not just saying this is the way the federal government works, so we just have to accept it. It's saying, you know what, the country can work better. And it works better when we respect our equal areas of jurisdiction and we find areas of overlap. That's what I've been doing since November, is what I will keep on doing every single day to convince Albertans that Canada can work, and it will work, and it is working in the best interest not only of us but also of Canada. The issue regarding the court judgment, and I have to say there's sort of two judgments that came out at about the same time. One judgment was saying was against the Citizens Initiative Act altogether, saying it shouldn't proceed because all questions that could potentially be asked by citizens would be deemed in need of some kind of consent. And that was rejected. So that one came out because it was overly broad. So then it was followed up by this one that seems to put a requirement on Citizens Initiative to do a duty of consultation. And quite frankly, I don't even know how that would be possible. How are citizens who want to put a petition question forward supposed to comply with that? That effectively negates the Citizen Initiative Act. That's why I've said it's anti-democratic and we think it's an error in law. So we want to preserve the right of citizens to be able to have broad latitude to ask these questions on whatever topic they choose, and we will have to have a meeting with caucus and cabinet to figure out the particulars of the one that has been struck down. But the judgment itself has much broader implications for our citizens' initiative process, and we think that's the reason it needs to be challenged.
Okay. Do you think, though, that you can get a private proponent behind a pipeline if there is a referendum on separation hanging over Alberta for who knows how long? Well,
I think that what we need to do is make sure that the separatist sentiment is not as high as it has been in the last year. When the Liberals got elected, separatist sentiment went up to 42%. In our most recent polling, we've seen that it's somewhere between 33 and 35%, so it's coming down. Historically, it's been under 20%. That's where I'd like it to be again. I'd like for us to have Albertans feel such confidence that Canada is working for them that that separatist sentiment goes back to historically low levels. We're not quite there yet. There's a few more things that we need to do. But I think these kinds of agreements help to get us there. And that's what I need to work towards. So at the moment, I think that we have a pretty good deal that we're going to be able to celebrate. I think this will go a long way towards demonstrating that the new Prime Minister approaches the issue of cooperative federalism in a very different way than the previous Prime Minister has for the last 10 years. Now, it may not be the deciding factor for everyone, but it's going to, I believe, convince a few more people that Canada's worth fighting for and it's worth working towards.
All right. Now, meanwhile, here was the Prime Minister also speaking in Calgary, taking questions from reporters. And an interesting question was posed to him about whether he believes this is a good bet, that this is a wise investment. You know, if he were still in the private sector, would he see this pipeline project as something worth backing or something worth investing in? Here's what he said to that.
If you look at the overall picture, and I see this when I meet people in Asia, leaders in Asia, business people in Asia, on behalf of Canada. How are we viewed? We are viewed as a reliable country in a world that's anything but. We're viewed as a country that when we sign something, we honor it. We're viewed as a country that is now on the move, a country with ambition, with confidence, moving forward, a country that intends to build big. We're viewed as a country that is both an energy superpower and believes in addressing climate change. And so the ability to combine all of that is very, very attractive to Asian partners. Now, another component sorry, just in the translation, but of my answer, but it's fundamental to your question, is what does today's accord, or implementation agreement as it's called, what does it tell us? It's that the country works. The Government of Canada, the Government of Alberta coming together, challenging issues, but coming together with a common solution, a country with clear rules, predictable rules, carbon markets that's going to function, contracts for differences and other support and incentive mechanisms that are put in place, and it's moving forward. So all of that, if I were in the private sector, and I'm never going to be in the private sector again, but if I were, those are the components that get you interested, and I think there'll be a lot of interest here.
Okay, some interesting comments here from the Prime Minister, which I think will play well in Alberta. The idea that we need to be an energy superpower, that these kinds of projects are good for Canada, good for the economy, good for creating jobs. And I think that's why you see so much public support right now for these kinds of projects. People are worried about the economy, worried about trade with the United States. I think there's a lot to the idea, and it's probably why the Liberals are still doing well in the polls. Is, people like the idea of taking big swings, building big, being more ambitious in the face of everything that Canada is dealing with right now. Now it's time, though, for the Prime Minister to follow through. So we'll see. This pipeline project obviously isn't going to happen overnight, but we got a little bit more of an idea as to what the timeline is here in terms of submitting a proposal, getting this reviewed. A pretty quick process with the potential for federal approval by September of next year. So a lot needs to go right, but I think it is a good day, as the Premier said, for Alberta and for Canada. And we'll see what the political fallout is in Alberta and how it affects this debate that's happening around separation and some of the legal uncertainty now about a potential referendum. We've got more up at robbreakenridge.ca. You can read the latest there, and I'm sure there's going to be much more to come in the days and weeks ahead, including a decision the government needs to make in Alberta, not just about appealing this court ruling. Clearly that's going to happen, but whether they're going to be the ones to call a referendum, or what the path is to a potential referendum. Maybe that's next year. Maybe we have a general election before we have a referendum. Are they still intent on putting it on the ballot in October? Okay, so there was the Premier and the Prime Minister speaking at their separate press conferences following the announcement earlier in the day. Just as we wrap up this episode of the podcast, let me go back to that. I'll just let you hear what both had to say. All smiles at this press conference in Calgary, announcing this deal, announcing the plan to move forward with this pipeline project. It was the Premier and the Prime Minister, and the big announcement earlier Friday.
And hello, today is a good day for Alberta, and it's a good day for Canada. It's an honor to be here with Prime Minister Mark Carney to announce a major step forward in unlocking the enormous potential of Canadian energy. And I'm happy to share with Albertans that we'll be signing an agreement today that clearly sets out a pathway to the construction of a new oil pipeline to Asian markets, commencing as early as September 1st, 2027. The proposed West Coast oil pipeline would transport more than 1 million barrels of oil per day. This landmark agreement builds on the collaboration between the federal and provincial governments following the signing of the Alberta-Canada Energy Agreement, which was signed in November of 2025. Our governments have agreed to make targeted changes to our respective environmental policies that will lead to tangible outcomes that reduce regulatory uncertainty and create the conditions necessary for Alberta to significantly increase its energy production and exports to Asian and other markets. Today's implementation agreement also results in Alberta avoiding a significant increase to the federally mandated industrial carbon price, saving Alberta's industry partners approximately $250 billion in compliance costs over the next 2 decades to 2050. Under the new carbon pricing agreement, the industrial carbon price will be substantially lower than the previous federal policy, which would have required a carbon price of $170 per tonne by 2030. The headline carbon price will be substantially rolled back. It'll stay at $95 until the end of this year, and then it will increase to $100 for the next 3 years and reach $130 per tonne by 2035. This gives industry the time and certainty needed to plan, invest, and deliver real emissions-reducing projects without undermining competitiveness. It means that we're much closer to attaining our joint ambition to make Canada into a global energy leader and a trusted supplier of responsibly produced, lower emissions energy in the world. We've accomplished a lot together in less than 6 months. We've removed barriers that were holding back investment, like the clean electricity regulations and the proposed oil and gas emissions cap. And we've reached key agreements with the federal government on impact assessment cooperation, on methane equivalency, which we expect to finalize this year. Both governments also remain committed to working together with the Oil Sands Alliance, formerly Pathways companies, to advance the completion of the world's largest carbon capture, utilization and storage infrastructure project. At the same time, we're advancing the final submission to on the West Coast Pipeline to the Major Projects Office by July the 1st. We're also establishing an electricity working group with the federal government to explore new low-emissions technology, including nuclear, geothermal, abated natural gas, wind, solar, and hydrogen. As this work advances, the governments of Alberta and Canada remain committed to respecting constitutionally protected rights, engaging in early, consistent, and meaningful consultation with First Nations, and working with Indigenous communities to support opportunities for ownership and partnership. And I do want to sincerely thank the Prime Minister and his officials for approaching these negotiations in a genuine spirit of collaboration and in pursuit of a stronger, more secure, and an independent future for Canada. I also want to thank people across Alberta for their patience and for keeping faith throughout this process. Thank you, and I'll now turn it over to the Prime Minister.
Well, thank you. To be clear, I was clapping for the Premier there. I wasn't clapping for myself. I want to thank you, Premier, on behalf of the people of Canada and behalf of my colleagues both in Parliament and my officials and your officials for the cooperative spirit and the hard work to get us where we are. As you said, we've accomplished a lot in the last 6 months, and we've accomplished it together, and I think that's the important point. You know, last week, the head of the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol, visited Canada, and he spoke about the most important commodity in the world, something that Canada has in abundance, something that we're building today, and that's trust. Trust to double the reliable and affordable energy available to Albertans. As the Premier just said, drawing on all the resources of this great province, natural gas, renewables, extending potentially out to nuclear, geothermal, and beyond. We're building trust of investors, that Alberta and Canada are reliable and attractive destinations where opportunities are plentiful, the rules are clear, and one project means one review. The trust of Asian countries who want our energy because they know that we are a safe, stable, reliable partner in a world that is anything but. Today's implementation agreement is comprehensive and it's interconnected. It covers, amongst other things, regulation, markets, methane, renewables, and carbon capture. It includes, as you just heard, Alberta's commitment to submit a comprehensive proposal for a bitumen pipeline to Asian markets to the Federal Major Projects Office by Canada Day, by July 1st this year, and Canada's commitment to pursue the designation of that proposal as a project of national interest under the Building Canada Act by the 1st of October. Now, earning trust, as we all know, it requires more than just ambition. It requires partnership and it requires cooperation. Cooperation that respects our duty to consult and ensures Indigenous economic benefits and opportunities for co-ownership exist in every project. Cooperation that recognizes British Columbians should share in substantial economic benefits from projects that impact them. And cooperation that will create tens of thousands of high-paying, rewarding, not just jobs, but careers across the skilled trades, engineering, and beyond. And today's agreement is also about creating a better world for our kids and our grandkids through major investments that will help put Canada on the path to net zero. Through a methane equivalency agreement that will lower methane emissions from oil and gas by 75% below 2014 levels by 2035. And through carbon markets that work.
All right, again, there was smiles and handshakes. Danielle Smith, Mark Carney, a deal on carbon pricing, emissions reduction, a path to getting this pipeline submitted as a major project, getting that expedited review and moving forwards. under the Major Projects Office. So the Premier calls it a good day for Alberta and for Canada. I think that's true for a lot of reasons. So long ways to go still for this project, some hurdles still to clear along the way, but I think this is a real positive development. That's one of the big stories this week. The other, of course, is where things stand with this separation debate and a possible referendum, some of the legal uncertainty around all of that. So as mentioned, more at robbreakenridge.ca, and I'm sure we'll talk much more about that issue in the days and weeks ahead on this podcast. So check us out at our website. Again, you can find this podcast on YouTube, on the podcast audio platforms. Thank you so much for joining us. Have yourselves a fantastic May-long weekend. We will talk to you next week, folks. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with The Rob Breakenridge Show.